G'day guys. This is a video on looking at sort of peak oil, looking at the current paradigm that we're actually told that we should abandon, decarbonize the economy, move on to renewables, solar, wind, and a whole lot of other even less efficient than those technologies like wave and a lot of other things. Now, they do have some capability of producing energy. That is not the argument. The argument is, can we do it? I mean, has anybody asked, can we do it? Do we have the resources? Do we have the capacity and stuff like that? I mean, nobody's asked that question, which is a very interesting question to ask. So let's take a look at the specific report. So I'll share my screen. Assessment of physical requirements to globally phase out fossil fuels by Associate Professor, Mineral Processing and Geometallurgy. So this is this year, the 30th of May, 2022, Simon P. Mitchell. And we're looking at different, let's go to the first one, this one here. As you can see, global oil production between 2000 and 2009. You can see between about 2004-5, this is even before the 2015, when we had this collapse in the investment. And see, there's your US fracking, that little strip there. There's shale, there's tar sands. And there's conventional oil, Saudi oil, Russian oil, Iranian oil, all these other conventional oil. As you can see, since this point here, it's pretty much flatlined. You don't see any of this massive increase. All the increases have really come in from more, the tar sands and more fracking. There's your offshore oil rigs. It's gone up a bit, and now it's starting to come, it's just barely keeping the numbers there. You can see there's a decline. This is Saudi oil production. The land oil stuff, that's declining even more rapidly. Okay, so even Saudi now, the Saudi Arabians have admitted they actually are using water. You can't, and water is a very precious commodity in the world today. They're actually forcing water into the oil wells in order to force oil up. That means we're beyond peak oil. That means easily exploitable oil that just gushes up. That's gone. That no longer exists. Now you need pumps and all sorts of systems which make oil extraction expensive. This is why some of the Saudis and many are reluctant to see a low oil price, because for them, they're also transitioning. They're trying to develop other systems and other energy systems and tourism and all sorts of things. They're trying to diversify their economy, trying to use their foreign investments to basically provide them with additional income. All these sort of things that they're doing is trying to transition their economy. They realize themselves, it's going, and we need to preserve this sort of these petrochemicals, obviously for agriculture and stuff like that, to be able to extend it until we can rebuild animal stocks up. Not the sort of stuff we're doing now, trying to decrease the animal stocks, because we'll need their fertilizer and them being able to rebuild soils. something that these idiot politicians don't understand. They're going to really set us up for a lot of calamities in the future. Okay. So, these are just general stuff. As you can see, demand keeps on going up. These are different sort of areas, discoveries. The big discoveries, this is where the big discoveries happened. That's production. All the dotted line is production. The biggest one was the Goa, Saudi Arabia, the big one. That's the massive one. That's the mother lode. And all these other ones, Kuwait came earlier because it was a British protectorate. And then you have Siberia here. Before that, back here in this sort of era, it was Baku, Azerbaijan. That was the area of oil production, that in the US. And that was that era back here. Kuwait was the big one, and then Saudi Arabia was the mother lode, the really big one. And then, as you can see, this is the period between the 50s to, you could say, 80s, is when most of the easily exploration and production happened. You've got Alaska here in the 70s. You've got Mexico in the late 70s. And after that, you've really only got the North Sea, which was in the 90s, which came online. That actually bumped it up a bit. Kazakhstan later on around 2000. And since then, it's just been declining, So it's been on a downward trajectory. And we can see here sort of gas, liquid, the different fields even there, it's these things are generally sort of declining. Demand for energy is going up globally. And when you don't have cheap energy, producing goods and services becomes more expensive. So that creates inflationary pressures. We know that from the 1970s, when we had stagflation due again to an oil embargo due to, the Arab-Israeli conflict, producing that. But since then, in this era, see, there's massive exploration. The level of exploration has been declining. We're finding less and less, and the demand is going up and up and up. So we need to make some changes, whether we like it or not. So it's not, coal is a great alternative to provide baseload electricity. The other one is nuclear, so we have to bite the bullet on those things. But obviously, they don't want the coal production side because of their carbon demon that they are crazy about, even though it's food for plants. But demonic people and the people that have got crazy ideas, they have demonized carbon, the stuff of life. We're all carbon life forms. But anyway, the madness of the modern era. But that's the sort of, easy exploration. That's where it happened. 50s to about probably, 90s. That's it. So we're talking about 40 years. That was the big, and especially after between the 50s and 60s were, this is when the big growth happened in this period. And then it sort of plateaued out and then started to decline. And production, this is production coming online. See, production is outpacing new discoveries because it's just lesser. We've gone everywhere. We've got ships out there going all over these oceans. We've got a whole lot of devices checking and trying to find new oil fields and all that. There's not much around. That's why we've shifted to gas now. Because there's slightly more gas fields, but even they still can't plug the big energy requirements we have as we move forward into the future. So this is the sort of situation. So there's your basically the different types up to 2018. So you can see coal plays a big role, oil plays a big role, natural gas plays a big role, hydroelectricity, very minor role, nuclear, very minor role at this stage. These are all the fossil fuels from there to there. They should actually put it right down there because even biofuels are all carbon-based. Anyway, and that's, when we're talking about biofuels, that includes wood. So anyway, seem to basically treat it very differently than coal and oil. It's politics again. Anyway, so those are the sort of, you're looking at nearly 85%, 84.7%, if not more. And that's the three: coal, oil, and gas. That's massive to replace. People think that we're going to do that in 12 years, or that they need their head examined. Truly, their head examined. So these are projected oil consumption levels. I'm not going to go into that. They're talking about the BRICS. They're talking about a 254% increase in the next coming years. The rest of the world, 71%. The United States, 54%, and so on. The reality is that, we would need 31 new Saudi Arabias to come online. Got it? Remember back in the 1960s, that big line? That's what we'd need. That big, massive line going up, we would need that. Good luck for that to happen. So, and these are, publicly available. This is the report that this scientist is doing, is, using publicly available stuff. World Bank, United Nations, Department of Economic and Social Affairs, Population Division, World Population Prospects, all these things. They're getting on the consumption rates of different populations there, around the world, what's happening, what demands are there, what are the trends. So, obviously, demand dropped quite a bit in the COVID lockups, because that's what they were, lockups. Now the prisoners have been unleashed back into the marketplace, and demand has popped back up, not to the level that it was, but it's heading that way currently because of shortages, because of the supply chain and all that, and a few other things, a few conflicts that the current Mr. Biden decided to unleash on the world. Wasn't enough. We had all the COVID sort of upheaval. We needed to add to that misery. But anyway, he had a person to replace in the Kremlin, so that was the priority, not the rest of us. So this is an assessment on the sort of alternative energy power systems to completely replace fossil fuels. So this is a report that was done, what's required and all that, exactly for your EVs, your transport system, your ships, maritime, utilities, plastics and fertilizer, you name it, all these different, numbers of cars, numbers of batteries, and all the sort of stuff that we need to transition to a utopian green future. Okay, so the report looks into all the different materials that are involved. Metals needed to phase out fossil fuels because we need to build batteries, and for battery storage, we need to build the windmills and all that. They've got a whole lot of different components that they require. So I'm just going to swivel through these. People can actually check these out at their own leisure. Sort of electric vehicles, charging batteries and all that sort of stuff. How much, how many vehicles need to replace, and the sort of, amount of energy we need for all these things. When you do a comparison, it just doesn't calculate very well. Let's put it that way. So this is in the terawatts, would be the additional requirements. New non-fossil fuel power stations, would need to, basically the new the power plant fleet in 2018 was that amount. We sort of need these sort of bigger numbers to replace. So, and you're looking at all these type a lot of alternatives to replace all the current, that 84.7%, which are fossil fuels. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. What do we need? How many of these things do we need? Wind power, windmills, solar power, solar panels, geothermal, tidal, whatever. All these, how much do we need? They're looking at all these sort of stuff, all these components that are required to come onto the grid. So, and this is all based on data from 2018. Okay. So, well, that's fine telling us this is the amount of stuff we need to build. This is the amount of stuff we need to produce. That's going through and looking at all the amount of numbers. But there's a critical thing. We need materials to build these. That's the most important thing. You can say to replace those energies, in the global system 3, we need to build all these things. Well, what are the materials that we're required to build those things? That's important. Okay, so people can look at this at their own leisure. There's sort of different composition, all that. The best alternative, in my personal opinion, that requires least materials and you get more bang for your bucks, is more concentrated energy, is obviously for base load replacement of fossil fuels, is nuclear, hands down. I know nuclear is a dirty word amongst the environmental lunatic lobby, but that is the only real alternative that they have, even though they hate it. But that's their problem. Anyway, this looks at distribution of sun radiation over the year, the amount and how much you can produce per year, per panel, blah, blah, blah. Remember, you need to maintain these panels, you need to clean them. There's a lot of involved. There's maintenance and stuff like that. They never calculate this when they do their reports, but there's a lot of costs involved. Stationary power storage buffer. This is in Horsdale Power Reserve in Australia, 100 megawatt. That was a Tesla one. So you've got EVs, electric vehicles, conventional vehicles, and this is all the sort of materials. You can see conventional vehicles require much less in that regard. Minerals used in selected clean energy technologies. So offshore wind, far more than onshore wind. solar panels. Nuclear is much less. Coal is much less. Natural gas even less. So you can see that building that infrastructure, energy infrastructure, when you go for wind in particular, you really need a lot of materials per kilogram, materials for megawatt of power. So you can actually see that solar is actually much better than actually wind in terms of the material costs. The problem with solar is that, you can't actually employ it in a lot of areas around the world because there's just not enough sun. So that's another issue. And some areas, some regions, it's just not practical. And it takes a lot of room, space as well. So while building a nuclear power plant requires far more material than a coal or a gas-fired power station, the difference is a nuclear will actually produce more energy per kilogram of ore. It's far more concentrated, so you get more bang for your bucks long term in that regard. So that's probably the best alternative, the one that is also hated that regard. So this will cover a whole lot of other things, but I'll leave that for other people to look at it. Rare earths and all that sort of stuff. It's just breaking down all the stuff that's required for all the different components and all that. What we want to do is, and this is the number of technologies and stuff like that, and these are general numbers and stuff like that: electric vehicles, EV, hydrogen fuel cells, wind turbines, solar panels, power storage batteries. So it gives you some of the numbers involved with those technologies, so people are interested. These are the metal needed. So these are all the different types of metals that are required for a lot of these sort of things. Okay. Batteries for EVs, for different things. So when it comes to hydrogen fuel cells, pretty much platinum is the primary one. Now, this is the most important one. Metal production in 2019. So the total metal required produced one generation of technology units to phase out fossil fuels. So this is basically the entire amount of energy that we need to be from alternative energy. That means that 84.7% is pretty much that amount. And so they are looking at, what are the materials? Copper. You're looking at a massive, which we're nearly 4.6 billion tons. But in the global metal production in 2019 was only 24,200,000. So nickel, you can actually see the numbers for these things are quite large, even of the rare earths. And the production of these is much lower. And when we look at the amount of years required, based on 2019 production levels, it would take nearly 189.1 years for copper, 400.2 years for nickel at the current production levels, unless we increased it by a massive order. So the mining industry would to be able to do this in 12 years or 30 years or whatever, we would basically have to, increase the mining industry multiple times. It's not going to happen, guys. That's a pipe dream. Lithium, nearly 10,000 years. Forget it. Most of the goons will be dead by then, way before then. Cobalt, 1,733 years. Graphite, that's not the synthetic stuff, which they can make in factories, 3,287.9. Silicon is the only one that only takes about 5.9 years. That means solar panels tend to use more of that. Is much easier than wind in that regard. But still, solar panels do require a whole lot of other things, other materials that are also, so you're constrained. You may be able to get the silicon part, but there are a whole lot of other materials that are also going to be a bottleneck. So you won't be able to do it in that amount of time either, because you need the other materials. So, so don't then be wishful thinking of, it's not like even platinum, which is a major one for hydrogen fuel cells. There are a whole lot of other materials that are required for the casing. The fuel cell itself is not just the platinum inside. There's a whole casing outside it, and that uses other materials as well. So, that was just looking at the primary. That was in that other page that we saw, the primary materials. But you're going to be using other things for the casing, which will be some sort of intermetallic. We may have some copper, some nickel, some cobalt and other things, some steel and stuff like that. And I was surprised it didn't actually show steel production. So yeah, that was a bit, and cement production, because they're very important. It's only looking at metals, obviously, but steel is a metal. So yeah, I was surprised that wasn't covered. Most people don't talk about steel, but you still, if you're putting up a wind, turbine, there's a certain level of steel in that structure. So anyway, and germanium, which is a rare earth, you're looking at 29,113 years. Forget it. I mean, it's just a joke. It's an absolute joke. If these people are saying end of the world in 12 years, I mean, you might as well just kiss the world goodbye. We know it's bullshit. But, these people are just completely unrealistic. On the one hand, if you actually say, let's double the mining industry output, guess what? These same characters would be out there protesting to not actually allow extra mining to happen. So where are they going to get the resources to build their windmill and solar panel utopia? Well, they're not. That's the unrealism that exists in that movement, and the bullshit. It's just pervasive in that regard. So these are the conclusions that this scientists have made. Additional non-fossil fuel electrical power annual capacity is 37,670.6 terawatts. The same fossil fuel energy mix of 2018 translates into 221,594 new power plants. So, to put it in context, the total power fleet that means everything, all the power stations that exist, all types, including fossil fuel power stations. So, your coal-fired power stations, your nuclear power stations, all of them together, globally, all the power stations, the total is 46,423. And these people are saying, if we go to non-fossil fuel energy, will require this larger amount of numbers. So 221,594 divided by 46,423. We're talking about nearly a 5-fold increase. It's just not doable. It's just not doable. It took to build these power stations, the number of power stations, it took a whole century to build up to this sort of stuff. I mean, it would take 500 years, and that's if we increase exploration by a massive order. everybody became a miner. Like in the past, remember, everybody was a farmer in the past, in the feudal area. You know, everybody would have to become a miner. There'd be no other occupation. Even doctors would have to abandon their, and get some of those fatties out there, doing hard yakka. Probably be good for their health. But everybody would have to become a miner. So it's just impossible, It's just a joke. It's an absolute joke. So, I mean, even if you were to basically hang a little kibble treat in front of these people to work harder, you still wouldn't get the results. So, there's probably not enough kibble to basically produce. if we lower the petrochemical products, we won't be able to produce enough food to feed them to be able to build these damn things. So it's just an absolute joke, guys. It's a joke on the rest of us. Total mass of lithium-ion batteries required to phase out fossil fuels is 2.78 billion tons. So the number of 100 megawatt stations would be 5.7 million, and the mass of lithium ions would be 2.5. I mean, it's just beyond a joke. Because you need basically for wind and solar, you need this buffer, a 4-week buffer. Otherwise, you've got massive blackouts and stuff like that. And if you try to take out the entire system, basically you end up in the 17th century with a small group of people, very wealthy people that can actually have electricity, and the rest of us have none. We're back in the 17th century. Maybe that's their plan. I don't know. It's crazy. So, conclusions, current thinking has seriously underestimated the scale of the task ahead. Oh, yeah, Coachy. Nuclear is vital to keep industry going, but can't be scaled up to be the only energy source. Obviously, it can't be scaled up because it requires years to build capacity to replace the amount of, remember the amount of nuclear, it's just a very small amount. To scale nuclear to the level, you'd have to be building, heaps and heaps of power stations every year around the world. So I'm not sure exactly the number, but somebody did say we're talking about you're getting into the thousands of nuclear power stations. The exact number, I'm not sure, to replace. And if we're using smaller, like safer type smaller reactors, then it could be in the tens of thousands potentially. So it depends on how far we go in that direction and how much fossil fuels we want to replace in any given time. So complete, depending on the type of nuclear power station, whether it's a large or a small type, then the numbers really go up. And then the materials also go up. A larger one requires less material compared to a smaller one. So there's another bottleneck. How many can you produce per year based on the production of materials that we're getting out of the ground? So I haven't seen those numbers and I haven't looked into those numbers. But, as you can see, the numbers just don't add up at all. Biofuel may be the only way to power aviation and plastic and get plastics. So, so we can get maybe some aviation, and aviation will end up, if we go down this way, middle class people and poor people will not be able to travel, and it will basically be the purview of the rich people to fly around in jets. That's because it'll be expensive. It cannot be scaled up to replace petroleum. That's just the reality. So, your airline ticket, rather than being, $1 or $2 grand, will end up being 10 to 20 grand, which basically will be outside the price of most people. So, as I said, it'll be only for the rich and famous. Battery chemistries other than lithium ion should be developed, each with different mineral resource requirements. So he sort of is suggesting that they should look at other things. There's a projected mineral shortage to supply raw materials for battery manufacturing. 2019 production rates are not even close to being appropriate. We saw the numbers. How long? Copper, nearly 189.1 years. 2020 mineral reserves are also not large enough to deliver the needed volumes. So that was where we were looking. I did pass that. These are the global mineral reserves, as you can see. For the requirements of copper, we only have about, that's stuff that we know that exists. Obviously, you could go out and explore or go deep underground, tunnel very deep. Maybe there's additional copper in other places. But the stuff that we know, proven reserves, that is, where we've actually explored and found proven reserves, you've only got about 19%. Nickel, 10.10%. Zinc, we've got more. Manganese, we've got more. When it comes to lithium, lithium battery cars, 2.33%. Not even 2.5%. So the amount of lithium that required to create the batteries for buffering the grid and for cars, that's why they say you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. You won't have a car. There'll be just a small fleet of cars that you'll be able to rent, like an Uber car and rent. You won't be able to afford a car because that's what the future will hold. And they'll make a small fleet of cars that will service everyone, and the rest of us will be on public transport. Won't be able to fly anywhere, be on public transport, and will basically be eating kibble. That's the future that they have designed, envisaged for us. Cobalt, 3.5% is all we have in reserves. Graphite, 3.6%. And then when we're looking at vanadium, 3.5%. Zirconium is far more, but still, you've only got 1, 2 of the, because this is a metallurgical type silicon, which you can actually get silicon from anywhere. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 5 things that that we've got more than we require, and that's out of 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11. So less than half is covered, but you don't have the other stuff, and that's just of these reserves. That's not covering everything. Remember, we were looking at, there's a whole lot of other materials here and rare earths and stuff like that that are also required for the batteries in particular, in that regard. So yeah, it's not going to happen, guys. It's just not going to friggin' happen. Now, I came across this a while back, but I didn't make the video. Peak Prosperity just made a video and covering this point. And so I said, I better make a video, and I'll also link his video up here for people to view his video and some of the other stuff that he has to say on this subject matter. I just wanted to go through this because he hasn't gone through it in his video thoroughly. He sort of touched a bit here and talked about a few other things and all that, which is good, in that regard. It's just a video that I was aware, but, as I said, my channel is primarily focused on on things like nutrition and health and stuff like that. But I have said in my live streams in the past that we don't have enough materials to be able to make this utopian future. It's just unrealistic. And this is the reason for it. It's a video that I was going to make, but in a very different way. But I decided to make it and also let people know about the peak prosperity one as well, since he's put it out there before me. And so at least bring this report to people's attention so they know, what's happening, what we can do, what is practical. And I'll provide a link to this. I've still got it on my drive. I've got basically this PDF, but I'll put on the major just on that. So if that ever dies, I've still got a copy of it, so I can still load it up on the drive, make a shareable link and stuff like that. So I'll leave it at that, but I'll provide just a link directly to the report. People can go and look at it, and they can actually place it in other places. They can share it with their friends and stuff like that and say, well, look, here's a university professor that's actually assessed the stuff, looked at it, realized it's completely a pipe dream to be able to do this sort of stuff. The only alternative is, for base load is probably nuclear. Basically, and that would require massive investments in nuclear, especially thorium reactors. And that's not going to happen anytime soon, because you would require to build thousands and thousands and thousands of such stations, which is one thing. And I can't see that happening. We're not going to replace in 12 years' time 84.7%, 85 nearly percent of our infrastructure in 12 years. It's not going to happen. There's not enough workforce to be able to do it. The global workforce could not do it in that amount of time. The global workforce, maybe if we're able to find all the actual minerals, maybe we could do it in 100 years or 200 years or something like that. Maybe if most of us became miners, but in 12 or 50 years or whatever, forget it. It's nonsense. It's an absolute pipe dream. Unless they want to knock us all off, starve us to death on kibble, and collapse the population one way or another. There's not going to be a green transition. It's not going to happen. Anybody that believes that needs to get their head examined. It's just not going to happen. The numbers just don't stack up. And I think people need to become aware of, the absolute nonsense of these arguments. And they need to also understand that, all these models that people are using in the climate BS environment is just that. It's just models. It's fabricated data. They take data, they manipulate it, and then they tell you that this is what's likely to happen in the next so many years. Because it's like the LDL story. LDL is bad. So if it's high, you must die in certain years' time. But hold on, you've only done an LDL study you've only looked at these people for 6 months or 1 year. How can you extrapolate from that that's going to be the result? Oh, that's my ideology. My ideology tells me that is what's going to happen. So if your numbers are high, you're going to die. It's the same thing with this sort of stuff. They say, well, my numbers are telling you that is going to happen, and it's not based on reality. When you look at the raw data, you don't see the signal. And also the raw data is very highly confounded. We're talking about information that is being highly fabricated. Then when we look at the satellite information, we had a period when the Challenger disaster happened there, but the researchers, the guy that actually retired now, the researcher was actually saying, we were calibrating the system every 12 days. It did not actually spike up or create some unusual increase back then or a different measurement. They're trying to claim that it did, when the people that were, in charge of the actual satellite didn't see anything of the sort. But it allows crackpots to then fabricate and make up shit. And that's what they do. They find all these, they ignore certain things, or they rub things out of the history, and even though the funny thing is, Tony Heller and a number of other people that actually point this out, they go back and look at the old newspaper clippings, the old scientific journals and all that. They have the data in there. You can't hide it. Yeah, okay, you hide it in the official documents you put out today because you're a crackpot fabricator, because you're driven by politics and ideology. But you can't hide the past that's actually been published that shows the numbers. What the weather was back in the 30s, what exactly the numbers were. You can't hide that information. Yeah. But what they rely on, that the majority of people are not going to look at that historical data. It's only the people that basically don't believe in the bullshit narrative that are going to look at that and say, well, we caught you out. But the problem is, it's a very small number of voices saying we caught you out. What we need to do is get that information around to people so they can see it. And we also need to get this report around to people and say, well, hold on, you guys are claiming this. It's not going to happen. Download this, send it to your, or the link to it, send it to your pollies, to your politicians. Get them to look at this and realize they're on a hiding to nowhere. The reality is they can't make this happen. It's not going to happen because it just can't happen. The myth has to be exposed. We need to start pushing back and saying the ability to basically phase out fossil fuels, 84.7% of energy production, with these alternatives is completely unrealistic. It's not going to happen. And we need to point that out. And maybe then these people will start investigating a bit these clowns, these climate clowns, and look at, what exactly is their data? Because, when people are motivated, even politicians, they're going to question stuff. They're going to say, well, they got that wrong. They said we could actually transition all that. Did they get other things wrong? You know what I mean? So we need some hard facts. Here, these are hard facts. They can't dispute this. This is the amount of stuff that we've got that we know that are reserves, they're well-documented reserves. This is the amount of production we've got. This is what we require to replace the other things. They don't count. They don't calculate. They don't add up. So if one thing doesn't add up that these people are claiming we can do, well, these clowns must have got other things wrong as well. We need to expose these clowns for what they are, charlatans, and with an ideology agenda. There are all sorts of elements in that. There are elements that are pushing a specific ideology for their own reasons, or for another way of bankers to spin off new profits, like new type of financial instrument, because you've literally got so much debt in the system with so many other things. There's only so much debt that can be taken up by housing and everything else. So what's left? Well, carbon credits. That's a new thing that you can actually ramp up, and then you can actually speculate on that as well. So there's a new bit of growth, for a banking system which is, only grows through debt creation, by generating new instruments of debt. There's no other way that it can grow. It's a parasitic thing in the economy. And it's grown in a lot of countries between 40 and 50% of GDP, and it's become a sort of a monster. And this is why you've got these BlackRock, all these big funds that are sucking in money and then using these AIs to rip off everybody in the marketplace and just gobble everything up. And it's pretty much what's happened. You just can't compete against this stuff. Basically, AI in the stock market and stuff like that should be banned because it's an unfair advantage. It's like anabolic steroids for people in the finance sector. That's how I view it. It's an unfair advantage for somebody to be able to use this technology to suck up a lot of wealth within the economy in a parasitic way when they produce nothing to generate this wealth. They absolutely produce nothing. They contribute nothing to the society, these parasites, and it's basically them and the zombie, social media corporates that are all part of the same sort of structure, serving each other and looking after each other, one virtual signaling the other. It's, then they've got a whole lot of young people out there that have had their minds manipulated and are not focusing on, real social justice issues, the exploitation of these people, the abuse of power of these people. They're not focusing on these things. They're focusing on an imaginary thing called carbon and climate change, So that's the problem. The reality is we've looked at the data. We've seen that we had, back in the medieval period, there was a medieval warm period, then a cool period. Then, the records, the real records, not the fabricated modern records, but the real records, when we find them in the old magazines and the old scientific magazines, show that the 1930s were very warm. And since the 1930s, the temperature was coming down to the 1970s and then came up again. These are cycles. Nothing to do with, you can't say carbon is driving temperature. Well, why did the temperature decline from the 30s to the, we had the Dust Bowl, remember? The temperatures were much higher than even currently, that have been. That's why we had a Dust Bowl. And globally, there was, massive drought and millions died in Africa, in China, and all sorts of places back in the 1930s because it was so much drier and hotter. It was going through these phases that it goes through. And we had the decline towards the 70s and then an increase again. And then we'll have another decline in the future again, which they won't be able to explain, even though carbon is still going up in this period. The temperature is doing this, going through these cycles. So even there, but if you're a crackpot, you can take the data, the heat island effect, amplify that by saying that carbon is the key player, amplify that and come up with a result that just looks unrealistic. And we've seen it. They always underestimate. Every 5 years when they look, they have to adjust their models again because they got it wrong. They keep on getting it wrong. Only the Russian models that actually have a lower sensitivity for carbon, because they don't consider it as a big problem, their models are actually still above what is actually measured and observed, but it's much closer because it actually lowers the importance of carbon. It's just ridiculous. Because if it was, we would have never seen the decline of the temperature into the 1970s. And in the 1970s, those asshats wouldn't have been screaming off the top of their head saying, oh, we're heading into another ice age. That's what they were saying back then. I remember, because I was a young fella in Greece in the late 70s, and I was actually reading Scientific America, and it was actually talking about this problem. And also they were talking about the heat island effect. And they were saying, because certain people were saying, oh, well, the temperature in cities has been going up, are you certain? And then these people that were talking about we're heading for another ice age will say, well, hold on, that's the heat island effect. And it's when you look at, you take that data out and you look at the data coming from regions, farming areas and all that, there the temperature's been going down, not up, because that's an anomaly where you've got too much asphalt, a lot of power generation that generates more heat, as a consequence, but it's localized. It's, you can't rely on that. You shouldn't have stations there so close that you should exclude that data altogether. And when you do, the picture looks very different, what they're telling you. Then the relationship between carbon and temperature even widens. So they have to adjust it by using this and fabricating their data. That's how they do it. So it's a lot of bullshit, unfortunately, but a lot of people are making money from it. And a lot of people have got a lot of vested interests and agendas that they're pushing. We've talked about these sort of things. It's unfortunately very hard to discuss these things on YouTube because otherwise you can lose your channel as a consequence. So I have to be very careful what I say. But all I can do is show you facts and say, these are the facts of the minerals that are required to replace, and they just don't compute. I suspect the other things don't compute as well, And what I'm saying about the heat island effect and the different stations, terrestrial stations that actually show no effect, like a very little effect when you look at them. When you look at sea level rise, very little. Some areas it goes down, some areas it goes up. That's plate tectonics. There's nothing there either to see. So when you look at raw data, we're talking about actual observed nature, like a scientist looking at a pulsar, doesn't say, oh, you know what? That measurement that I took of that pulsar really contradicts my theory. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to adjust that data because my theory is correct. That observation needs to be adjusted. That's what they do. That's not science. That's fabrication. That's the problem in nutrition. That's the problem in most science today. We have this rationalist view where we create models, and we, as scientists, can use mathematics to adjust things and adjust the outcomes to suit our ideology. That's not science, guys. That's pseudoscience. And it's politically motivated. And there are people out there that are pushing it. And if you take a look at most of these people that are basically pushing the kibble agenda, that are pushing that, what are they? They're all these crackpots from the 1960s, academia, that have infiltrated. They're vegans, vegetarians. They've got a really strange agendas. And even on the other stuff, the agenda stuff as well. If you look at those sort of characters, they're all the same. And they've got very much a misanthropic agenda that they're pushing. So a whole lot of different groups amongst them. And unfortunately, I can't discuss that on YouTube and go there. You should come occasionally to the Zoom sessions so we can have these conversations. But not many of you turn up, so you miss out on being involved in interesting conversations that we have sometimes. Anyway, that's about it, guys. So I'll put the Peak Prosperity recent one video up here as a link for you guys, and a couple of other ones of mine I'll put here as well that covers certain aspects and things that we've talked about. I'll put in the description, I'll put that that study, the global assessment. So you can use that information because that's quite clear, that information. That's really easy. It's not a lot of like hundreds. I've got other ones that, like one that was 585 pages, which covers all this sort of stuff. It goes all into all the intricacies and all the materials that are required to build this component and that component. But, we need aggregated numbers to be able to show people so it's obvious to them. They can see this is what we're using currently. We need to take all this out, and these are the materials that are required for that. And it just, one doesn't add up with the other. And they need to realize that unless you want to live back in the 17th century, and a small elite have all the energy, the small amount of energy that will be left, and all the actual benefits, and the rest of us can't travel. Basically, peasants again. Unless you want to live like that, go for that sort of option. But I'll tell you, the majority of us don't want to. We say no to such such a future. It's not a utopian paradise. It's basically a dystopian future. So no, thank you. So pretty much that's it. See you guys.